The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the Ethos Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
As we continue through our session here, we're going to be looking at fundamentally two basic types of explanation. Either the universe and human beings are the result of mindless, non-purposive processes, a series of events that sort of accidentally produced the world as it is, produced us, or we're going to explain these things in terms of creation and design. That the universe and human beings are the creation of a powerful, intelligent creator and designer who intended to create them for some purpose. Now we have to make a choice, and the choice has implications. If the universe and mankind came about by accident, then we do not live in a Christian or theistic world. We might live in a deistic world, or maybe an atheistic world, or some other kind of, religious worldview picture, but not a monotheistic Christian one. And if that's the case, then any further questions about the Bible are entirely beside the point. How we think about the Bible, those questions are not even on the table if we don't live in the right kind of world. And that's why we're going to address those in the third session and try to establish that, in fact, we do live in a created and designed world. And if that's the case, then how we think about the Bible, those questions become relevant. If the universe and mankind came about through creation and design, then we do live in a theistic world. And then the identity and character of the creator, the designer, then we can talk about him and we can discuss whether there's just sort of a Jewish picture or a Christian picture, a Muslim picture, or some other type of God. Then we can think about the details of the biblical story, and they become relevant. Okay, so that's kind of the rationale for how we're going to look at these issues in this session and in the next. Okay, all right. Now, there is a struggle between these two types of explanations. I touched on this a little bit last time. There is a cultural struggle. There is a philosophical struggle. There is, I would say, even a spiritual struggle between them. For any scientist to speak openly of design and a designer, especially in the biological sciences, is very dangerous to their career. There are very much in play certain philosophical ways of thinking that act as sort of gatekeeping mechanisms to keep design hypotheses out. And if you put these ideas out there, if you're not in a secure position, you can find yourself the target of. They will not defeat your ideas, but they will try to ruin you professionally or legally or some other, you might say, extra scientific, extra intellectual, extra academic means to silence you. And there are a number of scientists that could be mentioned. If you want some exposure to this, I do recommend the DVD Expelled by Benjamin Stein, who explores this. Now, why is it this way, though? I mean, why is there this struggle? I mean, isn't this all just sort of philosophy? Isn't this just thinking of, we have different ideas about the past, about science, about how we got here? I mean, can it just stop there? I mean, why does so much hinge on it? Why do people fight over it so much? Well, it seems that for many people, especially in the biological sciences, Darwinism seems to function as some kind of a secular religion. And so it's in a sense, it functions as the atheist creation myth. And because it plays that role personally, psychologically, sociologically, culturally, it's sacrosanct. To call it into question is akin to something like blasphemy for a certain group of people. Now, if you think about a scientific theory, it seems like the whole ethos of science is that no theory should be sacrosanct. Even if it's well evidenced, there seems to be something deeply wrong if we take a scientific theory and we exempt it from criticism. It cannot be criticized. It cannot be questioned. But it seems that Darwinism today occupies something like that position, especially in the West. In 1998, there was a survey in the United States by the National Academy of Science. And according to this survey, nearly 95% of biologists identified themselves as either atheists or agnostics. In a 2003 survey of leading evolutionists, 87% denied the existence of God. And of course, Dawkins has famously said that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And so I think we would be a bit naive or foolish to deny that this plays some kind of role. Now, of course, we have to deal with Darwinism as a theory and not just try to unmask the motivations of those who perpetrate it. But at the same time, I think it is a bit naive to say that that doesn't play a role, especially when we see the way that they react to people that try to put forward a different idea. It's not just the science that we're dealing with here. It's the worldview and the personal commitments that go along with it. Given the anti-religious views of many leading Darwinists, it's certainly possible that some of the closed-mindedness towards alternative theories like intelligent design might stem from personal prejudice as opposed to just a dispassionate evaluation of the evidence. There's a great deal of dogmatism in the scientific establishment regarding evolution and idea, and I think that's a tragedy for genuine science. I actually don't want to see Darwinism shut down or silenced. I think ideas need to be discussed and debated. And even if someone, I would suggest that an evolutionist that cares about science should welcome criticism of Darwin because they may not opt for intelligent design at the end of the day, but they might still disagree with Darwin and think some other mechanism is needed to explain what's happening. And in fact, that debate goes on, and we'll see some of that as we go through. Okay, now we're going to look at various kinds of design arguments, and there are a lot more that we could talk about. Design arguments go back a long time, even to the ancient Greeks, and there are different ways we can think about design, but we want to focus today on the modern intelligent design movement, and typically where you see this is applied to the level of cosmology, the universe as a whole, and we'll discuss something called the anthropic principle in a moment, and that the universe looks like it's designed with us in mind. And then design in living things, looking at biological data. Do we see evidence of design in living things? So that's what we will focus on for the rest of our session. Now, in terms of design in the universe, first of all, let's talk about the beginning of the universe and what science seems to say about that. In cosmology, the most accepted theory is the Big Bang theory. And I think there are many Christians that have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to the Big Bang theory, that it's some kind of atheist creation myth or story. I actually don't think that's the right reading of it. It's very interesting. Before the triumph of the Big Bang theory of the universe, the infinite universe or eternal universe kind of a cosmology was more of the fashion. And they didn't like the idea of a universe that has a beginning, because then you need to seek a cause of the universe outside of the universe. And so it obviously has some kind of theistic implications that many wanted to avoid. And so there were many scientists who were opposed to theism who were dragged and screaming by the force of the evidence to the Big Bang Theory and the beginning of the universe, despite the theistic implications. They couldn't deny the evidence. The universe had a beginning a finite time ago, which implies a beginner of a transcendent sort, outside of all of the matter and energy and so forth that began with the universe. And so, even before the Big Bang Theory, I mentioned last time, there was a long-standing philosophical argument, even from the Middle Ages, that the universe had a beginning. And I think William Lane Craig has written quite well on this in several places, the Kalam cosmological argument. You can look that up, but I think the philosophical argument itself is definitive, and the scientific evidence now is just adding confirmation. You might say that the Big Bang Theory is just a scientific discovery and explanation, description of creation ex nihilo, from nothing, what we theologians would talk about in those terms. Now, whether or not it's biblical is a second question. But I think if I can correct just one thing that I hope Christians won't say, is that the Big Bang is an atheistic theory. It's not. It's not. It was resisted because of its theistic implications. Well, what were some of the evidences that were discussed? Well, Einstein, first of all, in his theory of general relativity, predicted an expanding universe. Now, initially, he didn't like that idea, and initially, as he developed his theory, he basically had a mathematical error in it, and by that mathematical error, he did away with the beginning of a universe. According to general relativity, the universe is expanding. Now, if it's expanding, that implies a beginning, okay? And he didn't like that. He saw this implication, so he wanted a sort of a static universe. And at first, he was able to maintain that. But he was corrected by a few other mathematicians and astronomers that he had made a few elementary errors in mathematics. And once corrected, it predicted an expanding universe. So theoretically, that was kind of where the groundwork was laid. In fact, there was a Belgian astronomer and Jesuit priest named Georges Lemaitre who was happy with an expanding universe. He was one of the people that corrected Einstein. And he went on to argue that if the universe is expanding, then if we so-called wind the tape backwards, that eventually you would contract to a point, and that would be indicate the beginning of a universe. So this was kind of the theoretical background. In the 1920s, late 1920s, 1929, the astronomer Edwin Hubble discovered, by looking through the telescopes, that in fact the galaxies were expanding and they were moving away from one another in every direction, in a sort of isotropic motion. No matter which direction you look, every galaxy is moving away from every other galaxy, and the farther away they are, the faster the separation is occurring. Now, the only explanation for this kind of uniform isotropic movement is that the universe itself is expanding. Think of it like a raisin cake that you're baking in an oven. It starts off with this kind of mix and you got the raisins in there, but as it heats up, as it bakes, it expands. And every raisin is moving apart from every other raisin. The raisins are the galaxies, right? And, so if you have two raisins that are kind of close together, they'll be moving apart, but more slowly than if there's a raisin on the other side that's expanding in the opposite direction, right? And so this has often been used to illustrate this. Another analogy you can think of is if you have a hand grenade that explodes in outer space, right? There's no friction out there, so it would just expand indefinitely, forever, right? Now, let's say if the explosion had happened and you kind of came in and were looking at the pieces in the middle of it and you were watching the pieces go out from each other, well, you could just mentally, or if it had been videotaped or whatever, wind it back and you would see them come together. In past history, it had started at one point from which it had all exploded outward. And this is how then they thought then this is what the universe looks like. Well, from this and various other things, they made certain predictions. Fred Hoyle had championed a steady state theory. They tried to resist this Big Bang theory. Even after World War II, it was still very much debated. But the astronomer George Gamow and some associates predicted that if the Big Bang Theory is true, there will be a faint microwave background radiation that will be like a leftover radioactive glow from the Big Bang that should be coming from every direction because, of course, it will pervade the whole universe. It won't be coming from like one point, like from a certain star or distant object, but it will be suffused throughout the universe, and it should be detectable and uniform. And this was discovered in 1964 by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson. They weren't looking for it, but they detected it, and it took them a while to realize what in fact it was. A background radiation of about 3 degrees Kelvin, which matched the prediction, in fact, that was made. And this prediction was confirmed, and other sort of attendant predictions have been confirmed again and again and again. And the more they go on, the more they confirm it. So scientists have discovered that the universe has a beginning. And this has clear theistic implications. A beginning requires a beginner. And when we think about the cause of the beginning of the universe, well, the universe contains all the matter and the energy that the sciences study. And we cannot factor in any of those things as a cause. Those things cannot play any role in terms of as being a cause. They're all part of the effect. I mean, laws of physics, okay, gravity. Well, if there's no matter, gravity's not going to do anything, right? So no matter what physicists might think of, you cannot find an explanation for the cause of the universe within the universe. Okay, so maybe the cause of the universe is something metaphysical, not physical. And so some of these scientists have sort of testified of the implications of what they've discovered. Arno Penzias, who was one of the discoverers of the background radiation, for which he won a Nobel Prize, he said, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. Stephen Hawking has said this, being an atheist, he said this, it would be very difficult to explain why the universe should have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. Now, you may, depending on how you integrate your science and your understanding of the Bible, you might have some reservations about the Big Bang Theory, and you might raise the question, is it okay to use scientific evidence that agrees with the Big Bang Theory? Because, I mean, we do like the beginning of the universe and its theistic implications, but is that okay to use that kind of a thing? And if it implies an old universe and that sort of a thing, is it okay to argue that the universe was created and designed if we have some reservations about the Big Bang Theory in general? Now, we'll look at this a little bit more closely in the next session, but let me just put this out for you to consider, okay? What we're trying to do right now is we're engaging in a little bit of natural theology. We're looking out at the natural world and to see what does it show us about the world that we live in and what implications in terms of our understanding of the Creator and so forth. It's a second step to argue for an explicitly Christian biblical worldview. And so I would say at this stage we have a certain amount of freedom to explore this evidence and see where it takes us, and what are the philosophical arguments, what are the scientific evidences, what do they show, where do they take us, and then subsequently, in the light of biblical revelation, some of our intuitions, some of our previous reasonings may need to be reevaluated and revised or reconsidered, okay? And so we will do that a bit in the next session. Secondly, as a Christian apologist, and every Christian should be an apologist in some sense, an ambassador for their faith, he has two choices. He might decide, well, I don't have any problem biblically integrating something like the Big Bang Theory with my understanding of Genesis or creation or what have you. And if that's the case, then he can just go ahead, no problem, just use this evidence and present it as true and as pointing towards the biblical God. But there might be some that say, I don't read Genesis that way. I don't think it can be read that way. And I take more of a young earth approach at 6 24-hour days. And if that's the case, then it would be wrong for you to argue as if this were true on Monday, and then on Tuesday say, well, it's not really true because the Bible says something else. I argue it on Monday to show, yes, universe is created and designed. I'm arguing it as if true, but then Tuesday I say, no, it's not true because the Bible says something different. But there is a way to use it appropriately, and I would say to use it in a for the sake of argument kind of a thing. And that is to say, even the best standard science out there that many of you atheists accept, for example, are already pointing towards a beginner. So you're not owning it and affirming it as if true if you take a young earth approach, but in a for the sake of argument kind of thing. You guys believe in the Big Bang, but the Big Bang points to a beginner. You see the distinction that I'm making? That would be an appropriate kind of argument that is not inconsistent or contradictory, okay? What we say is true on Monday we should not change on Tuesday when we have a different agenda, okay? All right, well, keep that in the back of your mind. But I hope you're at least sufficiently convinced that this is not an atheistic picture of the world. It is a theistic picture of the world. Biblical? Well, that's a secondary question. We'll come to that. Okay, now in terms of the anthropic principle, it looks like there are design characteristics of the universe as well. It looks like it was created with us in mind. Mainstream cosmologists, people like Paul Davies, who I don't know what his perspective is now, but at one point he definitely was an atheist, agnostic, okay? These guys are at the forefront. People like Frank Tipler, I think he's more of a kind of a New Age guy, Frank Tipler, but discovering these different parameters that are necessary for life. A Christian astronomer and apologist by the name of Hugh Ross has collected these in a convenient way in several of his writings, things like The Creator and the Cosmos. He has identified and enumerated, and we might quibble about the exact enumeration of these things, but he's identified 35 characteristics of the overall universe that have to be just so. That if in any of these 35 variables there is much alternation, either increased or decreased, we can't be here, okay? And he's identified 66 such variables that pertain to a smaller portion of the universe, like the Milky Way galaxy or the solar system or the Earth-Moon system. So, I'm not very good at math, and that's why I'm not a scientist, but I think I can work this out. That's 101, right? 101 variables that have to be set just right. And there's a certain degree of permissible variation, but in every case, it is a very narrow range where there's no life. There's no intelligent life, okay? So we can think of this as like the control dials of the universe. Imagine if you, let's say they landed on Mars, let's say, and on some part of that planet that they hadn't scouted, let's say they found a biosphere. You're familiar with these kind of things, like an artificially constructed environment. And let's say it's fit for human beings to live in it. They have a dial that increases the gravity a bit, and things. And they find the control room. And let's say they have 101 dials in the control room. And these things could be set to anything. Gravity could be stronger than it currently is, let's say. Expansion rate of the Big Bang. Well, I don't think they could do that at the biosphere. My analogy breaks down. But constants like that. The dial could be set hypothetically to a wide range of things. But what fits what we need for life is in fact very narrow. And the control dials of the universe appear to be set just so. And it's this discovery over time, or I should say a whole series of discoveries that mainstream scientists have uncovered that have led to them to coin this term anthropic principle. You might hear anthropology. This is from anthropos, the Greek term for human being. And the idea, and there are different versions of this, some are a bit weird, but what they call the weak anthropological principle is just a simple observation. It looks like this universe was created or intended for us to be here, because these different control dials are set just right. The more of these variables they are, and the more narrow the parameters for each one, the more improbable it becomes that you could just say it turned out this way by chance. And so in cosmology, it's very common for them to talk about design. to use words like designer, creator even though these people may not be Christians. And so this is considered to be very strong evidence. Some examples of some of these things I've put up there. I have mentioned the rate of the expansion of the Big Bang. If the Big Bang is expanding too fast, you're not going to have stars and planets form. You're just going to have particles, protons and stuff. It's very fast. Okay, so it can't be too fast because we need stars and planets. Okay, if we're going to be here. But if it's too slow, then the whole fear of the gravitational collapse is a problem, okay? And it's a very narrow range that this rate can be changed. If you're interested in some of the specific numerical parameters, Hugh Ross, I think, does a pretty good job with these. The values of the fundamental forces of physics, things like electromagnetism, gravity, the strong nuclear force, the degree of what's permissible is infinitesimally small of what can be altered to allow life to exist. The mass of a proton. These are just things that are a given, but it seems like they could have been other than they are, and yet they are exactly what we need. And now I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to belabor this point. These kind of things in detail, I think you should get someone else to talk about, but go pick up a book by Paul Davies or any of these so-called non-Christian people that talk about this, and I think it's pretty amazing. And so this has led them to talk quite openly about design. There's another thing that they talk about, not just the just right control dials of the universe, but what you might call just so events that made life possible here. And I'll just give you one example, and that is the Earth-Moon system. Now, there's some interesting things about our Earth-Moon system. The current theory of how it originated is that a planetoid, probably about the size of Mars, collided with the early Earth about 25 million years after the Earth was formed. And as a result of this, the core of the colliding body was absorbed into the Earth, which resulted in a very large iron core relative to the size of our planet. And the lighter material and the fragments from the early Earth as well coalesced into the moon eventually. Because we have this Earth-Moon system, we have certain benefits. The moon stabilizes the tilt in our orbit, stabilizes our seasons, and things like this. Temperature variation is minimized. And we have this large magnetic core which generates I should say a large iron core, which generates this magnetic field which protects us from cosmic rays and a lot of other bad things that we otherwise would not have protection for. If not for the moon, we wouldn't be here. And it's a very large moon relative to the size of the planet. Now, that is what I would call a just so event that has happened that has made life possible here. Okay? It's really fascinating. And so it's not just the just right settings, it's also the just right events that have happened that have made it possible to be here. And if you just leave it up to chance, now you couldn't absolutely rule it out as a logical possibility, but the more of these variables that come up, the less and less probable that seems to be. A new spin on the design argument has been offered to us by Guillermo Gonzalez and J. Wesley Richards. Gonzalez is an astronomer, so I think maybe should get the primary credit. Typically, people that have argued for design have said, we need design to explain why it's possible for life to be here. But they've taken the argument a step further and said that it turns out that the best place for life to exist is also the best place for scientific discovery. In fact, Gonzalez was led to this by contemplating a lunar eclipse. And he recognized, it's very interesting that the moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but it's 400 times closer. So the result is that when there is an eclipse, the disk of the moon is perfectly superimposed over the disk of the sun. And because of that, scientists can discover things about the sun. There are certain things about the sun that can only be seen and detected scientifically during the total eclipse. And if it wasn't for this perfect superimposition of the moon disk over the sun disk, they would not be able to discover this. And he thought, that's really interesting. We need the moon for life, but this particular moon and its size also enables us to discover things. And this started a whole train of thinking for Gonzalez, where he began to explore, are there other examples of this? And he found a lot, actually. And I invite you to check out their book, The Privileged Planet, or the DVD that's associated with it. I'll give you one more example. Gonzalez is his work has led to the discovery of several planets. He's a very accomplished astronomer, young astronomer, but he was hounded out of his position because of his Christian commitment and his work in the intelligent design movement, which he did on the side, not in the classroom. That's a story in itself. But he discovered one thing about the Milky Way galaxy. Now, I think we're all very familiar with, when we think of the Earth and the Sun, we understand quite readily we have to be at a certain distance from the sun. If we're too close, too hot, right? Too far away, freeze. Okay, so we understand that. Now, but it turns out that in a similar way, the Milky Way galaxy has a certain range, a certain circular range away from its center where it's safe for our solar system to be.